I'm very thankful that Walter allows me to, every 6 months, to kind of come and talk about Ukraine, because it helps me kind of formulate my thoughts about recent developments in Ukraine and the security situation there. And the title of this panel is Assessing Ukraine. And I think that's the correct title right now, because we're in this period of kind of really assessing and trying to understand what Zelensky's government is going to bring to the table, and what the implications are going to be for the national security side of that. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty that we don't know. And I would say that I would give Zelensky probably if I was going to grade his performance right now, I was kind of going 50-50, and now I'm not so sure. It's kind of sliding a little bit. And I think that, and first of all, it's a great pleasure to be here with Bob McConnell and Steve. Steve's always helps me kind of zero in on what I want to say and think about, and it's a great pleasure to be with Ambassador Courtney, who, when I was 20 years ago, would come to hear him speak at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute when you were at the NSC, and so we all benefited from your knowledge about the Caucasus, and so it's a great pleasure to be here on the same panel. So when we're looking at the situation, my own view has been trying to look and see how what was happening after the election, prior to the election, and I would say that right from now until September, we're in a really dangerous period for Ukraine, because we don't have a lot of personnel. Zelensky's still interviewing people. He's still not quite sure about the people and personalities, and we ourselves kind of in this period where we really don't know, and a lot depends on these people and personalities. And so I don't have conclusions, but I do have observations about the situation. And I'd say that I was very struck by the presidential debate when nothing was said about national security. It kind of reiterates this view that General Hodges has repeatedly said, and he said this at a conference in Tartu in March. He says, I go to Ukraine and I talk to Ukrainians and officials, and sometimes I really don't get the impression that it's a country at war. And it really, and I say that there's a lot of truth to that argument. Case in point is that if Ukraine really was a country in a state of war, since last June, there's been no senior military attaché at the Ukrainian embassy here in Washington. Many of you knew the very highly competent General Havrilov that was here. He was recalled home. He was forced to retire. And that embassy has been adrift in terms of they've got some capable younger, colonels and lieutenants there. But I'm sorry, but they need a general there. And of Ukraine's bilateral military relationships in the world, there's no country more important to Ukraine. And I don't mean to insult our Canadian colleagues that are here, but I'd say no country, and I'd say Canada second, but the first one is the United States. And it really mystifies me when I get emails from Havrilov and I'm asking him what he's doing back in Kiev, and nothing. It's really absurd. And so again, that's just one anecdote that I can provide by a country not being at war. And so proceeding from the presidential debates, and you look at some of the things that happened in development since Zelensky took over, because he was weak on defense, he promoted to the media this guy named Parshin. Steve referred to him, and I understand now that Parshin is going to be in the presidential administration. He won't be at the Security Council, but on the whole, he said some good things. He talked about a reserve force, territorial defense. Those are all great things, but then he questioned the need for a Navy. So, it makes you kind of wonder where these people, where they've been, what they're doing. And so I think that then you have the case in point where you have Zelensky on May 20th goes to the front lines, May 20th he goes to he declares a ceasefire on the front lines. Ukrainian units are told not to return artillery fire. There's a removement and repositioning of Russian military equipment in that ceasefire. So, and it was kind of a gaffe of sorts, a bad move by Zelensky. I think he regretted it later because, it's very important those Ukrainian units to be able to return fire. Then he shows up on May 27th, he makes his visit to the front lines. Now this is the part where I'm kind of applauding him in a way, because many of you know that when Poroshenko went to the front lines, he always came there in full combat gear. So here you have a civilian wearing full combat, he's wearing the military uniform, the flak vest and everything. And certainly, he's trying to be the war president. But Zelensky shows up and he's basically wearing a flak vest and that's it. He's wearing civilian clothes. So certainly he portrays the image of being a civilian, but one has to question by the judgment of things he's doing, whether he's going to make the right choices or not. And I'm not in that position right now to kind of make a conclusion on that. But I do think these are very important things. There's a gap in Ukraine in terms of this national security establishment. There's very positive things like Alexander Litvinenko, the head of the Ukraine National Security Council, I'm told is going to return or stay in his position. He's a very competent guy. And he's competent not just because he's been there for a while and knows everything, but he's also something you may not know. He's a graduate of the Royal College of Defense Studies in London, and that's a very important military program. And we have another distinguished graduate from that program who's going to be speaking here today, and that's Ostap. And so it's very important for these new generation of young people and to get this training abroad and to be able to serve in senior positions in national security. But that's very positive. We've also had the nomination of Ruslan Hamchuk as veteran of Ilovaisk, who supposedly, reportedly fought his way out of the encirclement of Ilovaisk. And in some ways, the key thing here is you have a chief of the general staff now who's a combat veteran, who's seen combat. And I do not want to, emphasize that enough. That is really very, very important. And so I think that will give him that training. But, we still don't have senior people in official positions like General Zabrodsky. We don't have Western-trained military officers in senior positions. We don't know where that's going to go. American staff colleges are not full of Ukrainian military officers. There's very, very few studying in the U.S. There still hasn't been a Ukrainian graduate of the Naval Academy in 24 years of independence, and it's a crying shame. So my kind of message today is that, and Steve kind of harped on this as well, is that Ukraine is just not mobilizing its resources. The country that is mobilizing its resources is Russia. And if you saw the Defense One report about the buildup in Crimea, that is still continuing. And so Ukraine organizationally still has to get moving and go in the right direction. There's still good, very positive developments. Case in point is there's a report out today by Union that talks about the other 4 island-class patrol boats in Baltimore are getting ready for delivery. So we're talking the 2 that are destined for Ukraine are going to arrive in August. So 2 plus 4 makes what? That makes 6, but in naval terms, what does that mean? A flotilla. So this is very important in naval terms because these boats are going to defend Odessa. Forget Sea of Azov. Sea of Azov right now is I don't even want to go into that. Odessa is very open and prone to being attacked. And Ukraine, until it gets serious about its national security, everyone talks about the need to regain Crimea and how we're going to get Crimea back and retake Crimea. And again, I've said this before: Crimea is surrounded by water, and if you're ever going to retake Crimea, you're going to need a navy. Now, I'm not talking about battleships. But I'm talking about the types of ships and equipment that you're going to need. Now, one of the things I found very interesting, in my comments here, is one of the hallmarks of the Second World War, and as we just passed the Normandy D-Day and celebration anniversary, one of the things that really played a role in the occupation of France and liberation of France was the Jedburghs. And many people haven't been paying paying attention to this, but the United States has started kind of a, if you ever see U.S. military exercises in the Baltic, they're talking about stay-behind military units of what this has been termed as the new modern-day jetbergs. And so I would like to leave a case in point. You know, there was, in the Second World War, after the occupation of Norway, Britain started a naval effort through the Orkney Islands called the Shetland Bus. And the Shetland Bus was a program of where they were transferring operatives from the OSS and also from the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, into occupied Norway. But the Shetland Islands were a perfect launching point for that effort to get into Norway. So you probably get where I'm going here. And my point here is that maybe it's time to start thinking about Ukrainian jetbergs and trying to develop a program and ideas with the use of a Navy of trying to organize some type of formed resistance inside of Crimea. But in order to do that, you have to have what Steve has mentioned, is you have to have a reform in the military. It's got the capabilities to plan and operate things. And one of the biggest naval operations in the history of the Ukrainian post-Soviet independence of the Navy was actually sending one of the patrol boats, or the tugboats, last September through the Kerch Straits before they were not interfered with by the Russians. And I want to ask my Ukrainian naval friends why it was important. He said, because we actually planned an operation, you know, and it was successful. And so this is the type of thing that every small little journey that you start with, you know, begins that way, and you have to start planning. And, you know, Zelensky is going to follow in the footsteps of being the second wartime president of Ukraine. And he's going to have a big learning curve. And I think Poroshenko was starting to learn. I criticized the Poroshenko government quite a bit, but I think that ultimately at the end of the day, he did what was the right thing. But he was very resistant to it, but he often did the right thing. And I think that there's a learning curve for a wartime president. I think that's going to be very hard for Zelensky to try to learn and how to be able to adapt. And he's already kind of made some mistakes. But he does, and by far, looks like he's getting a good team together. Vadim Pristaiko, the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations, to the NATO, looks like he's going to come back and be the foreign minister, and he's very capable and a very balanced guy. So I'll end on that note, and I think that, you know, we still need to kind of assess Ukraine and Zelensky. Don't be too critical just yet, but keep trying to encourage them to go in the right direction. And things like the patrol boats of the islands coming will force Ukraine to continue doing some of the things that Poroshenko started. And I think that's a very good thing. So.
If you look at the issues this panel is to consider, the last one, reliable ally. I'm going to get to things we are doing now, but I think you have to put reliable allies in the context of where we in the West have been historically. Whether it's the signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, or NATO and its unwillingness to give a work plan to Ukraine. I think the overall image, long term, has been in the West, there have been flocks of ostriches with their heads in the sand, hoping that when they take their heads out of the sand and look east, they're going to see something other than a malevolent Russia. Sorry, that's not going to happen. I'm not suggesting that we ever should have had boots on the ground, but we've been slow and incomplete in our response to Ukraine's needs and to our own national interests. When the Pentagon and NATO mysteriously were surprised by the little green men marching into Crimea, one had to wonder where they had been. When Russian tanks, armed personnel carriers, and troops came rolling across the border, the Pentagon spokesman, official spokesman, described it as an unchallenged arrival. Are you kidding me? What were the merchants, the farmers, and the winemakers supposed to do? Who even talks like that? That was 2014. This year, the head of NATO, before Congress, said we don't want another Cold War. Hello! We're in a live firing war right now. And NATO and the US national interests are involved. Going back to the Russian invasion, the Ukraine Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network, two of whom are on the panel with me, came up with recommendations far quicker than the United States on what to do. Listed specific sanctions within a couple of months that could have had, if all applied, a major impact. It was months before some of those sanctions started dribbling out. Delayed reaction is a sign of weakness and in lack of commitment. Okay, I've had my little bit about where we are globally as reliable allies. Yet sanctions have been imposed, and we, the United States, seem to have held the Europeans together so far on keeping them. But we have given a lot of aid. There isn't any question about that. Importantly, we finally included javelins and lethal weapons. And they are more important than just the individual javelins. There is a lot involved in the United States military providing assistance, an analysis, bureaucratic decision-making that has to be recognized in dealing with this overall situation. Among other things, at the Pentagon, there is something called doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, and education, personnel, facilities, and policy analysis. For those of you interested in the acronym, it's DOLTMPF-P. But the analysis is critical because it looks at what is actually needed and what can be effectively utilized before providing weapons and systems. We crossed a political threshold with the javelins. We have come to the conclusion that lethal weapons should be available. There is, however, a need for the Ukrainians to be careful and strategic in their analysis of what they think they need. No matter what the United States' intentions and willingness to help might be, our government does not want to be wasting taxpayer money on some wish list that is not tied to strategic, thoughtful, and weapons that can be effectively utilized. Ukraine spending some of its own money, the Department of Defense says this often, spending some of its own money would help because it would put pressure on the Ministry of Defense to think more strategically. We, Friends of Ukraine, need to be asking tough questions to official Kiev and require thoughtfulness on the part of the generals and the politicians to push for weapon systems that can be used effectively. And we need to be pushing our government to make sure we can provide what is needed and can be used. Ukraine does make this difficult at times. Ukraine should move to normalizing the defense trade relationship with the U.S. by having the Ministry of Defense have the ability to procure directly from the U.S. for defense articles and services. I understand that some necessary legal changes in Ukraine are taking place, but there needs to be activities followed by the legal changes. As with bureaucratic systems and processes changes, it will also be necessary for Ukraine to do a better job of using some of its own funds. That keeps coming up when you're talking to our government. Okay, so quickly, what have we been doing here in Washington? All you have to do is Google or talk to somebody on the Hill. The 116th Congress has a vast, vast number of bills that have been introduced and are being considered relating to Ukraine. I mean, let's see. There's legislation that would designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic as terrorist organizations. There's legislation that's been referred to before to designate Ukraine as a major non-NATO ally, which would have significant consequences. There is legislation that specifically calls for providing Ukraine anti-tank, anti-ship, anti-aircraft weapons. I can't predict where all the legislation will go, but the interest is there, and there's broad bipartisan support to help Ukraine. Because of time, I won't go into the fact that where defense appropriations and defense authorizations for FY 2020 are. 2 of the committees have acted, 2 have not. There's clearly going to be money for Ukraine. There's clearly going to be authorization for lethal weapons. We'll have to wait and see. Yesterday, the House Authorization Committee moved forward with its authorization bill. So I'll conclude there. If people have questions about those bills, I'll deal with that later.